Before we start the show, I want to wish my brother and sister-in-law, Jim and Jan Roy, a very happy and blessed 42nd anniversary. Love both of you.
The views and opinions expressed on Data and Dissonance are those of the host and panel and are intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This show may include strong opinions, satire, and commentary on current events that some listeners may find disagreeable. We encourage you to think critically, do your own research, and come to your own conclusions.
A U.S. fighter jet gets shot down. One pilot rescued, one still missing. Tensions rising, markets reacting, politicians talking tough, media trying to figure out how to frame it. And somewhere in the middle of all that, regular people are sitting there going, how big is this actually about to get? Because that's the question nobody's really answering right now. Not clearly, not directly. We're hearing words like retaliation, capability, control of the Strait of Hormuz. But what we're not hearing is where the line is, where this stops, or what it looks like if it doesn't. And the truth is, people don't just feel this on a map. They feel it at the gas pump. They feel it in the market. They feel it in that quiet moment where you start wondering if this is about to turn into something bigger than anyone planned. Because history has a way of doing that. Small moments that don't stay small. One strike becomes two. One response becomes escalation. And before anyone really processes what happened, the situation has already moved past the point of control. So tonight isn't just about what happened. It's about what happens next. This is Data and Dissonance. And tonight we're asking, how big is this actually about to get? All right, let's bring in the crew. It's Friday, and yeah, we've got a full board tonight. Because this isn't one of those stories you can just glance at and move on. This is the kind of situation that starts overseas and ends up hitting people right here at home in ways they don't expect. Brian's here, and I already know where he's at on this. He's looking at strength, response, deterrence. The idea that if you don't control the situation early, it controls you later. So expect some fire tonight, because this is right in his lane. Rachel's here. She's going to bring some balance into this. Because while everyone's talking escalation, she's looking at consequences. Not just military, but economic, political, and long-term. The stuff that doesn't show up in headlines right away. Daniel's here, and yeah, he's already connecting dots. Power structures, global positioning, long game strategy. The stuff happening behind the scenes that most people aren't even thinking about yet. And Skylar's here. She's going to challenge all of it from the human side. Cost, impact, escalation, and the question that always comes up in situations like this. Who actually pays for this in the end? And I'll be right in the middle of it, asking the questions that I think a lot of people are asking right now, but not really getting clear answers to. So let's get into it. All right. Let's start right where this thing got real. A U.S. fighter jet shot down over Iran. One crew member rescued, one still unaccounted for. That's not a headline you just scroll past. That's the kind of moment that shifts a situation, because now it's not just tension, it's direct engagement. And when that happens, everything speeds up. Rhetoric gets stronger. Options get narrower. Pressure builds, politically, militarily, publicly. And now you're hearing talk about control of the Strait of Hormuz, which, if that escalates, you're not just talking about a regional issue anymore. You're talking global impact. Energy, shipping, markets, everything. So here's the question we've got to start with. Ryan, I'm coming to you first. Is this a contained situation that can be managed? Or are we already past that point, and this is the beginning of something that's going to escalate whether people want it to or not?
I don't think this is contained anymore, and I think pretending it is would be a mistake. When you have a U.S. fighter jet shot down, that's not just tension, that's direct confrontation. That's a line being crossed in real time. And historically, once something like that happens, it changes the entire posture of the situation. You're no longer in a gray area of threats and warnings. You're in a position where a response is expected, not just politically, but strategically. Because if there isn't one, It sends a message not just to Iran, but to everyone watching that the line isn't really a line. And that's where deterrence comes in. You either establish control early, or you end up reacting later when things are already out of hand. I'm not saying anyone wants escalation. Nobody wants that. But strength and clarity matter in moments like this. If the response is weak or delayed, it doesn't calm the situation. It invites more pressure. And when you start talking about something like the Strait of Hormuz, now you're dealing with global consequences. Oil, shipping lanes, supply chains, everything starts to feel it. So no, I don't think this stays small. I think we're at the point where what happens next determines whether this stabilizes or starts to spiral.
Yeah, and that's the part that makes this feel different. Because once you cross into that direct engagement territory, like you said, it's not just noise anymore. It's not warnings. It's not posturing. It's action. And historically, when things hit that level, they don't just quietly de-escalate on their own. Something has to happen next. And in my opinion, that's where people start getting uneasy. Not because they know exactly what's coming, but because they don't. There's no clear off-ramp being talked about. You're hearing strong language, you're seeing movement, but you're not hearing what the end game looks like. And when there's no clear end game, every move starts to feel like it could be the one that pushes things further than intended. So Rachel, let me bring you in here. Brian's looking at strength and deterrence. But from your perspective, is escalation something that can still be controlled at this point? Or are we already in a situation where even a measured response could trigger something bigger than anyone's planning for?
I think it can still be controlled, but the margin for error is getting smaller by the hour. Situations like this don't usually spiral because someone wants a larger conflict. They spiral because each side believes they're responding proportionally. What looks measured from one perspective can look like escalation from the other. And when you're dealing with military assets, strategic choke points, and national pride, those interpretations matter more than intentions. And that's what makes this moment so sensitive. You've got pressure on all sides: political pressure to respond, strategic pressure to maintain control, and public pressure driven by fear and uncertainty. Add in something like the Strait of Hormuz, and now you're not just dealing with military decisions, you're dealing with global economic consequences. So yes, it can still be controlled. But it requires very precise decision-making. Because one miscalculation, even a small one, could move this from a contained situation into something much harder to manage.
Yeah, and that right there is what makes this feel like a tightrope. Because what you just said, both sides thinking they're being measured, that's how these things get out of hand without anyone actually intending it. Nobody wakes up and says, let's make this bigger than it needs to be. But step by step, response by response, it builds. And in my opinion, that's the part people don't trust right now. It's not just the situation, it's the margin for error. Because when you're dealing with something this sensitive, one misread move isn't just a mistake, it's a chain reaction. And once that starts, it's a lot harder to slow down than it is to speed up. So Daniel, let me bring you in here. We've talked about response, escalation, perception, but zoom out for a second. Is this just a moment that got out of control? Or is this part of a bigger strategic picture that's been building behind the scenes for a while now?
I don't think this is random at all. I think it's part of a larger strategic pattern that's been developing over time. Regions like this don't suddenly become flashpoints overnight. They build tensions slowly through positioning, influence, and competing interests. What we're seeing right now feels like a tipping point, not a starting point. And when something finally tips, it gives the appearance of sudden escalation, even though the groundwork has been there for years. And when you factor in things like energy routes, global supply chains, and regional influence, it becomes clear why this area matters so much beyond just the immediate conflict. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a location, it's leverage. Whoever controls or threatens that space impacts global flow, pricing, and stability. So this isn't just about one incident or one response, it's about positioning within a much bigger system where multiple players are watching, calculating, and adjusting in real time.
Yeah, and that's what makes this feel heavier than just a headline. Because if this is part of something bigger, not just a reaction, but positioning, then what we're seeing right now is just one piece of a much larger board. And that changes how you look at it. It's not just what happened today, it's what does this mean long term? And in my opinion, that's where people start to feel like things are out of their hands. Because once it moves into that bigger strategic space, it's not just about one decision or one response. It's about a series of moves that have been building for a while. So, Skylar, let me bring you in here. We've talked about strategy, escalation, control, but let's bring it back to people for a second. When situations like this start to build, who actually ends up paying for it in the end?
When situations like this build, it's almost never the people making the decisions who feel the first impact. It's everyone else. It's families watching prices climb without understanding why. It's workers dealing with instability in industries tied to energy, shipping, and trade. It's everyday people absorbing the ripple effects long before they ever hear a clear explanation of what's actually happening. And the frustrating part is, most of it doesn't feel immediate at first. It creeps in. Gas goes up, costs shift, uncertainty builds. And suddenly, something happening halfway across the world is affecting daily life in very real ways. And beyond the economic side, there's the human cost that often gets talked about later instead of up front. Escalation always carries consequences that extend far beyond strategy. Families, service members, communities. The decisions being made at a high level don't stay contained there. They move outward, and they're felt by people who had no say in them. So when we talk about how big this could get, I think it's important to remember that the scale isn't just measured in military terms. It's measured in how far those consequences reach into people's lives.
Yeah, and that's the part that hits the hardest. Because it's easy to talk about strategy, positioning, response. All of that makes sense at a high level. But like you said, the impact doesn't stay there. It moves, it spreads, and the people who feel it first aren't the ones making the calls. It's everyone else trying to go about their normal lives while something bigger starts shifting underneath them. And in my opinion, that's why this moment matters so much. Not just because of what happened, but because of what it represents. A line being crossed, a situation changing, and a level of uncertainty that people can feel even if they can't fully explain it yet. Because that's where we are right now. Not at a conclusion, not at a resolution, but at a point where the next move matters more than anything that's already happened. And the truth is, nobody really knows how big this gets. But everyone's starting to ask the same question. How far does this go? And what does it cost by the time it's over? All right, let's take this one a step further. Because if this is already starting to move outward, you're not just going to feel it overseas. Okay. Let's talk about the part nobody likes to connect right away. The cost. Because while all of this is unfolding, jets, strategy, headlines, something else is happening at the same time. Markets reacting, energy pressure building, uncertainty creeping into the economy. And people feel that fast. Gas prices start moving. Shipping costs shift. Businesses adjust. And before long, it shows up in places people actually notice. Groceries, bills, everyday life. And here's the thing. Nobody voted on that. Nobody signed off on, yeah, I'm good with paying more across the board because of something happening halfway across the world. But that's how it works. And it happens before there's ever a clear answer on where things are going or how long they're going to last. So let's start here. Rachel, I'm coming right back to you. Are we already starting to feel the early stages of that war tax? Or is the real impact something that hasn't even hit yet?
I think we're already seeing the early signals, even if they're not fully hitting people yet. Markets tend to react quickly to uncertainty, especially when it involves something as critical as energy routes. The Strait of Hormuz alone is enough to create pressure because even the possibility of disruption can drive prices upward. So what we're seeing right now is the beginning phase, the anticipation, the adjustment, the hedging. It's not the full impact, but it's the warning sign that something larger could be coming if this continues. And that's usually how these situations unfold. The immediate reaction is subtle. Small shifts, slight increases, a little more volatility. But if a situation holds or escalates, those small shifts compound. Energy costs ripple into transportation. Transportation affects goods. Goods affect everyday expenses. And by the time people really feel it, it doesn't feel like a sudden spike. It feels like everything just got more expensive all at once. So yes, we're seeing the early stage, but the real impact, that's still building.
Yeah, and that's the part people miss. It doesn't hit all at once. It creeps. And by the time it's obvious, it's already been happening for a while. And in my opinion, that's why people get frustrated with this stuff. Because there's no clear moment where someone says, hey, this is going to cost you. It just starts showing up, little by little. And suddenly, your normal expenses aren't so normal anymore. And the worst part? It happens before there's even a clear outcome. You're paying for the uncertainty before you even know what the end result is going to be. So Brian, let me bring you in. Rachel's talking about early signals and compounding impact. Do you think people are about to feel this in a real way? Or is this something that gets overblown every time tensions rise?
No, I think people are absolutely about to feel this in a real way, and probably sooner than they expect. Because like Rachel said, this stuff doesn't just sit in the background. Energy is the backbone of everything. When that gets unstable, it doesn't stay isolated. It moves through the entire system. Fuel affects transportation. Transportation affects goods. Goods affect everything from groceries to construction to everyday services. So when you start hearing about pressure around something like the Strait of Hormuz, that's not some distant geopolitical issue. That's something that eventually shows up in your weekly expenses. And I think where people get frustrated is that it always feels disconnected at first. You're told one story, strategy, conflict, response, but then the impact shows up somewhere completely different, like your gas bill or the price of basic goods. And nobody really connects those dots in a clear way. So yeah, I don't think this is overblown at all. I think this is one of those situations where people are going to feel it, and by the time they do, it's already baked in. That's how this works. The cost shows up before the explanation does.
Yeah, and that cost before explanation line, that's exactly it. Because people don't experience this as policy or strategy. They experience it as pressure. Bills going up, prices shifting, that feeling like things are getting tighter, even if nothing obvious has changed in their day-to-day life. And in my opinion, that's where the disconnect really hits. Because the people making decisions are talking in terms of positioning and response, while everyone else is dealing with the consequences without ever really being brought into the conversation. So, Skylar, let me bring you in here. We've talked about cost, impact, ripple effects. Is this just the reality of global conflict? Or is this something that could be handled differently so everyday people aren't always the ones absorbing the fallout first?
I think some level of impact is unavoidable when you're dealing with global conflict, especially when it involves energy and trade routes that affect the entire world. There's no way to completely isolate something like this and pretend it won't reach everyday people. That's just the reality of how connected everything is now. But that doesn't mean the way the impact is felt is the only way it can happen. Because a lot of the frustration people feel comes from the lack of transparency and preparation. It's not just that costs go up, it's that people aren't told clearly why, how long it might last, or what's being done to manage it. That uncertainty makes the impact feel heavier. If there were clearer communication and more proactive planning to soften the blow, people might still feel it, but it wouldn't feel as sudden or as disconnected from what's actually happening.
Yeah, And I think that's a big part of it, the uncertainty. Because people can handle tough situations a lot better when they understand them, when they know what's coming, when they know why it's happening, when they have some kind of expectation. But when it just shows up, when things start getting more expensive and nobody's really connecting the dots, that's when frustration turns into distrust. And in my opinion, that's where this goes beyond just economics. It becomes about confidence. Confidence in leadership, confidence in the system, confidence that someone actually has a handle on what's happening. And when people don't feel that, the impact hits harder than just dollars and cents. So Daniel, let me bring you in here. We've talked about cost, systems, ripple effects. Is this just a reaction to instability? Or are there bigger forces at play that actually benefit from this kind of uncertainty and pressure in the system?
I think it's both. On one level, this is a natural reaction to instability. Markets react, systems adjust, and everything recalibrates based on risk. That part is expected. But at the same time, there are always entities within those systems that are positioned to benefit from volatility, not necessarily because they caused it, but because they understand how to operate within it. When uncertainty increases, certain sectors gain leverage. Energy markets shift, investment patterns change, and decision-makers adjust strategies based on where they see opportunity. So while the average person feels pressure, there are always parts of the system that are adapting in ways that can turn instability into advantage. And that creates a contrast. On one side, you have widespread uncertainty and rising costs. On the other, you have strategic positioning and calculated movement. Both can exist at the same time and often do.
Yeah, and that contrast right there is what makes this feel uneven. Because for most people, uncertainty means pressure. It means tighter budgets, higher costs, more questions than answers. But like you said, inside the system, there are always parts that don't just survive that uncertainty. They move within it. They adjust, they position, they find ways to benefit from the same conditions that are creating stress everywhere else. And in my opinion, that's what makes the war tax feel different than just normal economic fluctuation. It's not just numbers going up and down. It's the feeling that something bigger is happening, something you don't control, but you're still paying for. Because at the end of the day, that's what this becomes. Not just a geopolitical situation, not just a military moment, but something that shows up in everyday life, whether you signed up for it or not. And that's the reality people are starting to feel. Not all at once, but enough to notice. All right, let's shift gears for a minute. Because while all of this is happening on the global stage, there's still plenty of chaos happening right here at home. All right, let's bring it back home for a minute. Because while the world's heating up overseas, things aren't exactly calm here either. So we're going lightning round. Quick hits, real reactions, a little sarcasm, and yeah, probably a few shots fired along the way. 3 topics, 3 rounds. Each of you gets in more than once. Keep it moving, keep it real. Let's go. Drug tariffs, America first or price shock? Trump rolling out tariffs, some up to 100%, on imported brand-name drugs. Framed as bringing manufacturing back home, but critics saying it could spike prices in the short term. Brian, kick us off.
Look, I actually think this is one of those moves that people are going to hate at first and then understand later. Because yeah, in the short term, anything involving tariffs can create pressure. That's just how it works. But the bigger picture here is control. We rely way too heavily on foreign production for critical things like medication. And that's a vulnerability whether people want to admit it or not. And I'd rather deal with some short-term pain to fix a long-term problem than just keep kicking the can down the road. Because if something goes sideways globally and we don't control our own supply, the price isn't just higher, it's availability. So yeah, I get the concern, but I also think people need to look beyond the immediate reaction and ask what the alternative actually is.
I understand the argument for domestic production, but the concern is how the transition happens. Because short-term pain isn't theoretical. It's people paying more for something they need right now. And for a lot of people, medication isn't optional. It's not something they can just wait out while the market adjusts. So I think the goal might make sense, but the execution matters a lot. If the burden falls too heavily on people in the short term, without enough support or planning, it creates real consequences. And those consequences don't feel strategic. They feel immediate.
There's also a broader strategic layer to this. Tariffs like this aren't just about economics, they're about leverage. When you start shifting production domestically, you're not just changing supply chains, you're changing power dynamics. And that doesn't happen without friction. So what you're seeing is a recalibration. The question isn't whether there will be disruption, there will be. The question is whether the long-term shift justifies the short-term instability.
And that's where balance becomes important again. The goal of strengthening domestic production can be valid, but the transition needs to be managed carefully. Because if the immediate impact is too severe, it can create resistance to the very change you're trying to implement. So it's not just about the policy. It's about how it's introduced, how it's communicated, and how the short-term effects are handled while the long-term goal is being built.
A G shakeup. Stability or chaos? Pam Bondi out. Todd Blanche stepping in as acting AG. Speculation already flying about who's next. Is this strategic or just more chaos? Skylar, start us off.
I think from the outside, it definitely looks chaotic. Anytime there's a sudden shift in a role that significant, it raises questions about stability and continuity. And when those questions aren't immediately answered, people start filling in the gaps themselves. That doesn't mean there isn't a strategy behind it, but perception matters. And right now, the perception is uncertainty, which isn't something you typically want in a position tied so closely to the legal system and federal authority.
Yeah, but I think people jump to chaos way too fast. Sometimes changes need to happen. If something's not working or there's a better direction, you make the move. That's not chaos, that's adjustment. And honestly, I think people read way too much into these moves sometimes. Every transition gets framed like it's some massive instability event, when in reality, it could just be leadership making a call. Not everything has to be dramatic.
But perception is part of the system. Even if the move is strategic, the way it's interpreted affects how people respond to it. And when changes happen quickly, without clear explanation, it creates space for speculation. That speculation can take on a life of its own, especially in a high-visibility role. So, whether it's strategic or not, the environment around it can still feel unstable.
And that's why clarity matters. Transitions aren't inherently negative, but the way they're communicated shapes how they're received. When people understand the reasoning and the direction, it builds confidence. When they don't, it creates uncertainty, and that uncertainty can overshadow the actual intent behind the change.
April elections. Early warning signs? Final one. April elections. Being framed as an early test for control heading into midterms. Are these actually meaningful or just overhyped political noise? Daniel, start us off.
They're meaningful, but not always in the way people think. It's less about the individual races and more about patterns. Voter turnout, messaging response, issue traction. Those are the signals people are watching. So while one result doesn't define the future, the trends that show up can start to paint a picture of where things might be heading.
Yeah, and I think people underestimate how much these smaller elections matter. They might not feel big, but they give you a read on energy. Who's motivated? Who's showing up? Who's actually engaged? And that matters heading into bigger cycles. Because momentum doesn't just appear, it builds.
I think they matter, but I also think they can be overinterpreted. Every result gets turned into a narrative, and sometimes those narratives don't hold up over time. So yes, they provide insight, but they shouldn't be treated like a final verdict.
Exactly. They're indicators, not conclusions. They give context, not certainty. And when they're viewed that way, they can be useful without being overstated.
Drug tariffs, AG shakeups, election signals, different stories. Same underlying theme: instability, adjustment, and people trying to figure out what it all means. All right, let's take a quick break. Then we'll bring this one home.
Before we wrap things up tonight, let's take a quick second to talk about the Data and Dissonance merch store. If you've been listening and you like what we're building here, real conversations, different perspectives, and actually breaking things down instead of just reacting to headlines, this is your way to support the show and be part of it at the same time. We've got hoodies, tees, trucker hats, mugs, bumper stickers, all built around one idea. Think for yourself. And of course, the coffee lineup is still going strong. High Lakes, light roast. Rock Creek, medium roast. Bitter Root, dark French roast. Strong enough to get you through headlines like tonight's. If you want to check it out, data-and-dissonance.printify.me/. Support the show, rep the message, and keep the conversation going.
You know, nights like this are a reminder of how quickly things can shift. One headline, one incident, one moment that changes the tone of everything. And suddenly, what felt distant doesn't feel so distant anymore. What felt like over there starts to feel a little closer to home. And I think that's what people are picking up on right now. Not just the event itself, but the weight behind it, the uncertainty, the feeling that something is moving, even if nobody can quite define where it's going yet. And in my opinion, that's the part we need to pay attention to. Not just reacting to what already happened, but understanding where we are in the timeline of it. Because this isn't the end of a story. It's the middle of one. And the middle is always the hardest part to read, because there's no resolution yet. No clear direction. Just decisions being made in real time with real consequences attached to them. And while all of that is happening at a high level, strategy, response, positioning, the impact doesn't stay there. It shows up in real life, in cost, in uncertainty, in that feeling that something bigger is unfolding, even if it hasn't fully arrived yet. And the truth is, nobody knows exactly how this plays out, but everyone's watching, everyone's waiting, and everyone's asking the same question. How far does this go? And what does it look like when it's over? That's where we are. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but right in the middle of something that's still unfolding. We'll keep watching it. We'll keep breaking it down, and we'll be right here with you through it. Remember, speak truth, stir thought.
Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the stories and the sound behind everything we're building here. If you like high-stakes tension, real-world themes, and stories that mirror the kind of pressure and uncertainty we talk about on this show, check out the Caleb Rourke thriller series. It starts with The Covenant Protocol, followed by The Prophet Directive, and continues with Black Echo Rising. All available now on Amazon. These are stories about decisions under pressure, about navigating chaos, and about holding on to who you are when everything around you is shifting. If tonight's episode resonated with you, these books will too. And if music is more your lane, the Data and Dissonance music catalog is available on all major streaming platforms. Uncaged, raw, reflective, and built from real-life struggle. Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, grounded, country-driven, and rooted in faith, freedom, and everyday life. And Stand Tall, Charlie, a reminder to stand firm when it matters most. Books for the mind, music for the road, and a show built to make you think. We'll see you next episode.